Welcome to the Would Be Better Network. My name is Anna Holmberg. I represent the Swedish forest industries, and I have the pleasure of guiding you through the next hour and 45 minutes. Today's topic is sustainable forest bioenergy and the role it can play in reaching European Green Deal objectives. And this is, without any doubt, both a very timely and relevant topic. Why? Because of ongoing negotiations on EU 2030 and 2050 climate targets, and because of the upcoming revision of the Renewable Energy Directive, also known as the RED or simply as RED. We will soon dwell and deep dive into this topic, but first I'm going to turn to my would-be better partner, Mr. Lennart Axell from the Federation of the Swedish Family Forest Owners. What do you expect of this afternoon?
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everybody. Very nice to be back with you at a would-be better seminar. My expectation from family forest point of view is that we are very interested in how the Green Deal policies can enhance the shift from fossil energy into the green fossil-free energy mix, including the forest and forest industry's residues. I'm looking forward very much to the discussions, to the presentations. I wish you an enriching seminar and, of course, today, a very energizing seminar.
And Lennart, can you please explain to the participants what is the Would Be Better Network?
Would Be Better is arranged jointly by the Swedish forest industries and the Federation of Swedish Family Forest Owners. Each network event is hosted by one of these 4 Swedish members of the European Parliament, representing different political party groups. The network aims to be an arena where we jointly can increase our knowledge about the forest-based sector and its role in relevant EU decision-making processes.
Well, thank you, Lennart. We reach you from a broadcasting studio in Sweden, and I can assure you that all arrangements are in line with existing restrictions in this country. Almost 350 of you have registered for this event, and I managed to calculate at least 17 member states among you. So thank you so much for deciding to spend part of this afternoon together with us. If you are active on Twitter during the event, we would appreciate if you include #WouldBeBetter. And if you want to pose a question, you can do so by logging on to menti.com using the code that you see on the screen in front of you, in other words 7251 1109. Enter your name, affiliation, the question, and preferably also whom you address it to. And please make sure that you apply the KISS principle, meaning keep it short and simple. It is Lennart who is mastering the inflow of questions, and we will do our very best to accommodate some of them, but most likely more towards the end of the event. To make sure that we are all somewhat on the same page concerning the political landscape that we're navigating in, let's start with a bit of a recap. Let's start with renewables, in other words, all types of renewable energy sources, such as solar, wind, hydro, geothermic, and bioenergy. For 2020, the EU did have a target of reaching 20% renewables. For 2030, the target is presently set at 32%, but the Commission has stated that it needs to be increased to approximately 38 to 40% to match raised EU 2030 climate ambitions. Among the renewable energy sources, bioenergy accounts presently for approximately 60%. And there are mainly 3 sources of this bioenergy. It comes from forest biomass, agricultural biomass, and organic waste. And out of these 3, the contribution from forest biomass is clearly the biggest. And that forest biomass is mainly residues and wastes from forestry and forest-based industries. The forest bioenergy is used to generate electricity, heating and cooling, and to decarbonize the transportation sector. Thereby, we can already today state that forest bioenergy is important as a contributor to several elements of the European Green Deal, such as security of energy supply, smart mobility, climate ambitions, and a more circular economy. At the bottom of this page, you are able to see the formal name or title of the Renewable Energy Directive, and I hope you can see that it's about promoting, in other words, increasing the use of renewable energy sources. In 2009, the first version of the RED came into force. A few years ago, a revision was negotiated, and it was quickly called the RED II. Political agreement was reached late 2018, and implementation in member states is pending, but it is due by the end of June this year. At about the same time, the Commission is to present a new revision, let's call it RED III. And once that proposal is on the table, the Parliament and the Council will engage in negotiations, and last time that took approximately 2 years. So what are then the important elements in the RED II affecting forest bioenergy? Well, of course, the overall target, but also specific sub-targets such as the one on advanced biofuels. Any rules enabling renewables, such as rules around permit processes and market design. The sustainability criteria for forest biomass, of course, and the verification of the same. And last but definitely not least, the Annex 9, in other words, the list of feedstocks eligible for production of advanced biofuels. The foundation for the sustainability criteria for forest biomass is the so-called risk-based approach. It was put in place to minimize the risk of using forest biomass derived from unsustainable production. And this is to be demonstrated by showing compliance with criteria and have this compliance verified by an outside auditor. The criteria were agreed in the political agreement in 2018. And before that, the Commission had years of dialogue with member states before the criteria were even proposed. And why was this? Because depending on design, the criteria could challenge the member states' competence on forest policy. And during the RED II negotiations, it was heavily debated whether the criteria would actually do the job or not. And I am very, very certain that we will hear much, much more on that topic here today. But in this context, I would humbly like to remind all of us that the 2018 politically agreed criteria are not yet implemented in member states. Today's host is Per Holmgren. Per is a member of European Parliament since 2019. He belongs to the Greens. Per is a member of the Parliament's Committee for Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, abbreviated ENVI, and a substitute in the Committee for Agriculture and Rural Development, abbreviated AGRI, Transport and Tourism, TRAN, and Protection of Animals during Transportation. So hello, Per. You are with us via link from Brussels. How are you today?
I'm fine, Anna. How are you?
I am fine as well. I'm just going to ask the control room whether the sound is perfect from your... Yes, I got the green light there. Everything is fine. Sorry for that, Per. So once again, happy to have you here as host today. Very, very welcome. And without any further ado, I'll leave the digital floor to you for your opening address. Please.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you very much, Leonard, as well, for providing some explanation and background regarding the current context. And of course, thank you very, very much for inviting me to host this Would Be Better session. And I really look forward to hearing different insights and ideas from the speakers during the event today. And as you've demonstrated, as we are working to align our policy and financial instruments to be in line with the European Green Deal, our desperately needed new climate goals and our commitments under the Paris Agreement, this discussion today is very timely indeed. And when it comes to climate, unfortunately, we all know that time is really, really running out fast now. The World Meteorological Organization last year stated that there is at least a 20% risk that one of the next 4 years will be above 1.5 degrees. And just by looking at the physics and chemistry of the atmosphere, we know that the warming compared to pre-industrial levels will be on a more permanent basis above 1.5 degrees within roughly 10 years from now. That is just one of the crises. Of course, the pandemic, fight against climate change, while at the same time respecting the capacity of the planet and maintaining biodiversity of ecosystems, and also, of course, meeting the demands of present and future generations, not the least when it comes to energy. We need to take all of these into consideration at the same time, and it really requires broad, holistic, and systemic perspectives. Further, in a context where unfortunately, many of the Union's forest ecosystems are in a bad state, and considering the projected impacts of climate change for the next decades, we really need to fully consider synergies and trade-offs in different policy objectives that affect both climate and environment. But within appropriate and scientifically established limits, bioenergy can play a significant role in mitigating climate change by replacing fossil fuels. I'm sure that we all agree on that. It's also the case that if approached the wrong way or without precaution, clear and unacceptable negative impacts on both biodiversity and emissions of greenhouse gases can occur, and this really has to be avoided. So, of course, it's very important to have established criteria and safeguards to ensure sustainable bioenergy use in the European Union. And this includes limiting the use of biomass for energy to levels that can actually be sustainably supplied. It includes ensuring efficient and optimal use of biomass resources, and it means fully implementing comprehensive and binding sustainability criteria. Now, like all resources, biomass resources need to be used in the most efficient way possibly, and the right kinds of uses of them incentivized to make the most of our planet's limited resources. We must do this through some sort of cascade use of wood. We've had similar discussions when it comes to hydrogen as well. And what kind of hierarchy is this then? First of all, we really need to lower energy use in most sectors. Energy efficiency must be number one. And therefore, we need policy. Thereafter, we need policy for resource efficiency and electrification. And the biomass we do use shall firstly be used then for long-lived products where the carbon remains stored. This is very important. Thereafter, it can be used in shorter-lived products to replace fossil-based products like, for example, plastic. And then finally, using sustainably sourced residues for which no better use exists than biomass is used as an energy source. I really think it's important that we look at this cascading principle when we're discussing biomass. And from my perspective as a policymaker, accurately assessing the sustainability of woody biomass requires increased transparency. I really want to stress that we need transparency and improved availability and quality of data, as well as monitoring and control. And we need to work more on our reporting procedure in the European Union. I mean, without reliably knowing how much and what type of forest biomass is used for bioenergy, no effective policy can be implemented, and there will always be disagreements then about its impacts. And of course, if wood for energy is subject to strict sustainability criteria, this cannot mean wood for other purposes can be produced through detrimental practices and pathways. And thus, therefore, while the focus of today and this discussion is, of course, bioenergy, we need also to see requirements of sustainable forest management to all forest products we consume. And while the use of woody biomass for energy takes place in an extremely complex framework, I really hope that today's discussion will provide further insight in this very important and timely topic. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Per, for that opening address. And you will return at the end of the event and have a bit of a discussion with me. And then we'll see what sort of takeaways we might be able to bring forward. So thank you for the time being, and I hope you enjoyed the discussions.
Thank you very much.
It is now time to turn to our first speaker. But before I do that, I'd like to remind you that you can post questions using menti.com and the code that you see on the screen in front of you. And our first speaker here today is Mr. Giovanni De Santi. Giovanni is Director for Sustainable Resources at the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission. Hello, Giovanni. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Excellent. And oh, and I'm just fine. I am so happy as long as the technology works as it should. So
Me too.
we have learned a lot in the last year, haven't we, to work digitally? But you always have a little bit of this feeling, is it going to work today as well or not? But it does. That's excellent. So in January this year, the JRC published a report on the use of woody biomass for energy production in the EU. And you have promised to share with us the main conclusions of that report. So without any further ado, please, the floor is yours, Giovanni.
Thank you, thank you. Can you put the slides, my presentation on, please? Hello? No, I don't see. Now I do. Can I then start? Yeah. Okay, so first of all, again, thank you very much for having invited me as Director of the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission to talk about this report that, as you know, is named the use of woody biomass for energy production in the EU. Now, you know that JRC is the scientific branch, so is the Director General in charge to provide science in support of the policy. And as such, now we performed this study, which we believe now will give a substantial contribution to already very lively discussion around the bioenergy sustainability. And this is important for a correct science-based final decision of the policymakers. So I think that this is the very first introduction. Now, let me clarify upfront why we did it and what is the target of this study. So just to eliminate the misunderstanding from upfront. So why we did it is quite easy, because as you know, the recent biodiversity strategy adopted by the Commission in May 2020 clearly announced that the Commission would have assessed the EU and global biomass supply and demand and related sustainability. And in this context, Commission also planned to publish towards the end of 2020 this report to assess the use of forest biomass for energy production. So this is also in the broader context of the European Green Deal, which clearly pushed to reconcile as much as possible the climate change mitigation targets with the environmental protection. So this means that the target of this study for us was simply to analyze the impact of bioenergy onto the biodiversity. So we are not going, and we did not go to assess any of the particular pathways from biomass to bioenergy. This was not our target. Our target was, if we do think that in the future the bioenergy could be even more used, so if there is a rise in the use of bioenergy, we wanted to understand, are there win-win solutions? So strategies whereby you can accomplish at the same time the climate change target together with biodiversity requirements. This was the clear target of this study. So next slide, please. So I now go to show the very first important result of this report, which is this Sankey diagram of the bio-based sector. And as you see, I think that this graph has the merit having put together, finally, many patches, heterogeneous, sometimes voluntary data provided by the different member states to different organizations like FAO, UNECE, Eurostat, or the National Renewable Energy Action Plan, under different reporting schemes. However, it does give, again, finally, an integrated overview with a mass balance. So I would like to start with three macro considerations. The first consideration is at the level of the source. And you clearly see at the center that the large majority, the vast majority of the wood used in the bio-based sector is definitely coming from domestic forest. There is a part of import, but it's not that much important compared to the internal source of bio-based or forest or whatever internal domestic wood. And then, however, there is a not negligible part of not estimated sources, so it's not declared sources, which clearly it prevents us to make a very clear final and decisive conclusions on the typology of wood used in the different sectors. So irrespective of the use, the final balance of the different typology of wood removal from your forest is prevented by this kind of quite relatively large uncertainty area. This goes back to what also the European member of the Parliament said. We need to have more clarity, more transparency, access to the data coming from this sector. This is the very first macro conclusion. The second, in the center of the graph, you can clearly see that in the bio-based and the forest-based sector, the circularity is very well embedded. So this is very well known, very appreciated, and I think is very well now recognized. So recircularity is very important, and this means that if you do go down to the bottom of the Sankey diagram, you can go to the third and most important conclusion on the bioenergy, which is replicated in the pie chart on the right-hand side. So you see that for the bioenergy, almost 50%, so half of this bioenergy is produced via the secondary wood biomass. The primary wood biomass is 37%, so it's very important, but still there is a big gray area of uncertainty because these not categorized sources, so we don't know whether it's primary or secondary sources for bioenergy, again prevents any kind of certain and definitive evaluation of the sustainability of bioenergy. So in this Sankey diagram, besides mass balance, you have two big areas of uncertainty at the level of source, where you do not know whether it's primary or secondary, and again, the same kind of, or not declared, and the same type of uncertainty you do have in the end when you do consider the mass balance for bioenergy, because you don't know whether it's this uncategorized secondary or primary biomass is very relevant. So this is just to make a kind of balance at the moment for the woody biomass sector. Now, if we do go to the second result, please. Okay. as I said at the beginning, if you now look to the future, so we want to see if the use of bioenergy will increase, Are there intelligent, fair solutions, or strategies to provide more wood from the forest, supporting both the climate change mitigation target, but also the preservation, the conservation of biodiversity, okay? And we have adopted three main criteria, three main strategies. The one of changes in forest management, in particular, increasing the collection of logging residues, one. The second is afforestation. The third one is conversion of forest to plantations. These are the three main avenues we have considered in evaluating the different possible solutions. And if you do look at this graph, you see on the vertical axis, you do have the climate mitigation, the climate emission mitigation, so carbon emission mitigation. On the horizontal axis, you do have, if you like, the risk or the pressure on biodiversity. So you do have four different quadrants. The green one on the left upper side is the best solution, where we have win-win solutions. So you have short-term or medium-term mitigation via the solution, and you also have a little reduced impact on biodiversity. If you move right-hand side to the yellow one, you do have still solutions that are still very effective in terms of carbon emission mitigation, but less effective. So there is a higher potential risk on the biodiversity. And finally, you go down to the last red quadrant, where you do have lose-lose solutions. So you have bad in terms of carbon emission mitigation, but also on biodiversity preservation. So we have categorized in these three quadrants all the pathways we have analyzed, and you see that there are win-win solutions. So in the green quadrant, there are solutions like, for example, number 5, which is removal of fine woody debris within specific thresholds, so threshold related to the landscape, to the particular ground, or, for example, afforestation of former agricultural lands with mixed species plantation. So there are and some others. So there are some strategies, some solutions to have, again, to conjugate and to accomplish both climate change mitigation in short or medium term, but also reduce the impact on biodiversity. On the other side, and the right-hand side, there are other families of technology that are still good for climate, let's say, for carbon emission mitigation, for climate change, but they're not as good as the ones before for what concern the impact on biodiversity. And these are the so-called win-lose solution. For example, afforestation on peatlands or natural grasslands. And finally, there are a third family of activity or solution you see in the red quadrant, whereby you have lose-lose solutions. So, for example, conventional or natural or old growth forest, so the primary forest to plantation, is a strategy which is considered bad in both terms, so for climate mitigation, but also for biodiversity preservation. So I want to go to the conclusion. The conclusion, or what we suggest from this report, are the following. If you go to the next slide, please. Okay, the very first, as it was already again mentioned by the speaker from the member from the European Parliament, we need to improve monitoring of woody biomass source used for energy. So we need more data. And for example, if we do extend, an example or a suggestion could be that if we do extend the sustainability criteria provided and foreseen by the RED II, and currently in use for the large energy plants, so bigger than 20 megawatt, to the smaller energy plant, this would already give a support and a more data, more transparent access to the source, biomass source. Second, as I said, we need to ensure that both European level and national level incentives promote possibly just a win-win pathway, so that we have identified in our report. So we need to give privilege and incentives to this win-win solution that we put in the green quadrant. Third conclusion, third message that I want to convey to all of you, that a possible suggestion would be to extend the RED II no-go areas, which is at present apply only to agricultural biomass, also to the forest. biomass. Fourth is that we support that afforestation intervention should be done only where it deserves to be done. So where there is correct ecological condition and not everywhere. So to avoid to afforestate where is not proper. So for, again, as I said before, for lands or which are really biodiversity, very rich in biodiversity. So this is not the best way to afforestate. And finally, we need to develop better tools, more modern tools to address also the risk associated to the import of biomass, on what respect the environmental footprint and the biodiversity. And in that respect, I want simply to announce that, as you possibly know, that JSC, together with DG Environment, on behalf of the Oil Commission, are very soon launching in the operational phase of the new European Forest Observatory, which will have just the mandate to monitor and to link a possible importation of wood biomass products, linked to deforestation or forest degradation outside Europe. This is just to monitor this, but also to make a much more modern tool to understand the situation, the forest degradation, or even the deforestation in Europe. So it's a kind of modern tool using, of course, the satellites now that we can give us improve and much more modern to help the understanding and the prompt remediation strategy for the health of our forest. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Giovanni. And I know that you are going to have to leave this event within shortly, so I will take the opportunity and fire off 2 questions to you. And the first one is that in your report of January, you state that a swift and robust implementation of the RED2 sustainability criteria could be effective to minimize risks concerning sustainability. But could you expand a little bit? What do you base that conclusion on?
Yes, I think that in that respect, and maybe I know that Giulio is there, so Giulio maybe can also provide some better elaboration. But what I can tell you that, again, the RED does provide already some theoretical reply for this kind of, to avoid this kind of precautionary principle. So theoretically, we do have this kind of, we cover this concern that we have already raised in the JSC report. However, the problem is that the full compliance relies on the effective implementation on national forest legislation and on the management system at the level of the source. So the devil is in the detail. So the RED 2 already provides, in theory, and let's say broadly speaking, all the precautionary principles. It does cover this concern that you mentioned. But to be confident that they are really applied, we need to look in more detail to the real implementation at national and local level. This is what I think is important to be mentioned. But again, I hope that, and I'm sure that Giulio will come back again on this Article 29, because again, this is very important for the sustainability.
Oh, yes. I think we will discuss that quite extensively here later in the discussion. So, Giovanni, at this point in time, I say thank you to you. But to all of our participants, Giovanni's colleague, Sara Mubareka, is going to stay online. So if we later have any JRC report-specific questions, she will be able to address them. But once again, Giovanni...
Yes, thank you to you and also to Sarah and their colleagues, because I think they did a splendid job, which lasts a lot, and they I think they provided very useful new element for the discussion of sustainable bioenergy, which is a very complex and dynamic issue. I know that it is evolving together with the policy, together with the knowledge, together with the technologies I mentioned before, available for us to understand and to put in place remediation. But this, I think, is a very important contribution. Thanks to all of you.
Yes, I agree. So once again, thank you, Giovanni, and take care. Our next speaker is Mr. Giulio Volpi. Giulio is Policy Officer at the Unit for Decarbonization and Sustainability of Energy Sources at the Directorate General for Energy, also known as DG Ener, at the European Commission. And Giulio is kind enough to replace Mrs. Katarina Sikov-Magni, who has been prevented from participating today due to other commitments. So, hello, Giulio. How are you today?
Hello, I'm very good. Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation.
Well, very, very good of you to be able to be here today. So without any further ado, I think very many of our participants are extremely angered to listen to the thoughts of the Commission now a few months before you are to present the next RED revision. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. As you mentioned before, biomass is currently the main renewable energy source in the EU and is key for achieving the 2030 and 2050 targets. For several member states, bioenergy is playing an important role in their clean energy transition away from fossil fuels, and has helped replacing and will help replacing oil, gas, and coal in several end-use sectors such as heating, electricity, and transport sectors. As we all know, bioenergy is a very versatile energy source, renewable energy source, that can be used in all these end-use sectors. Our analysis for achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 shows that we require increasing amounts of sustainable biomass for the energy and non-energy sectors. In particular, in the energy sector, bioenergy is important to help decarbonizing hard to abate sectors in the context of an integrated energy system, in particular the heavy-duty transport as well as industry, and also to deliver negative emissions, which would compensate those emissions that cannot be reduced. And here, in particular, I'm thinking about the use of bioenergy together with combined with carbon capture and storage. But of course, as we also heard from the previous presentation from Giovanni, the confidence in the sustainability of bioenergy is key for this future development of this sector. The Commission is listening carefully to the public debate on the potential environmental and climate risks related to further increased bioenergy production. Already, as you mentioned before, in 2018, with the revised Renewable Energy Directive, the EU sustainability framework has been significantly strengthened by extending the current sustainability criteria for biofuels and bioliquids to also biomass in heat and power. In addition, the 2018 directive, which is shortly being implemented by member states, includes new specific risk-based criteria for forest biomass feedstock. I should also say that I should also remind that the directive promotes also a cascading use of biomass. In particular, Article 3 of the directive requires the member states take care in avoiding undue distortions of the raw material market when developing the support schemes. And this is particularly relevant for member states' development of support for bioenergy. Let me also note that there is a lot of focus on the RED II sustainability criteria, but they should not be seen in isolation. In fact, they're part of a broader framework, sustainability framework, which includes a number of other horizontal legislation at European level. Perhaps the most important one is also the LULUCF regulation, the regulation on land use change, and forestry, which accounts for all emission removals from forest harvesting, forest management, including for biomass production. As we heard from Giovanni, their analysis found that RED II sustainability criteria for forest biomass can effectively avoid the potential environmental risks associated to increased biomass production. But it's important that these criteria are correctly and robustly implemented by member states. The implementation deadline for the directive, including the sustainability criteria, is June 2021, so a few months away. In order to promote the harmonized implementation of these criteria, the Commission is currently finalizing an implementing act, which provides guidance to member states on how to implement and verify the new criteria for forest biomass. And this a draft version of this act is currently on public consultation for 4 weeks until the end of this month. And of course, you all stakeholders are all invited to comment on this draft. As we heard, the GRC report also includes 2 main recommendations for further strengthening the sustainability framework. First, there is a recommendation to apply the existing land criteria that are for agricultural biomass also to forest biomass in order to minimize the risk of biomass harvesting in primary forests, including old-grown forests. And secondly, there is a recommendation to extend the scope of the sustainability criteria for biomass in heat and power to installation below 20 megawatt. Because so far under RED II, these criteria apply only to large-scale installations producing heat and power from biomass. The recommendation from the GRC has been that these criteria could be applied to installation with a lower total rated thermal input of 20 megawatt in order to improve the effectiveness of these criteria to cover a bigger share of biomass used in the EU, and then also helping, therefore, to get a better monitoring of biomass uses in Europe. So in the context of the upcoming review of RED II that was announced as part of the European Green Deal, the Commission is assessing a number of options for a targeted strengthening of the EU sustainability criteria for forest biomass. Our aim, in fact, is as we move forward with higher greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, as well as increased renewable energy targets, to find a right balance between promoting, on one hand, the sustainable production of biomass for the whole economy, material, energy, as well as preserving and restoring biodiversity and enhancing carbon sinks. So I would conclude here with these few remarks, and I'm happy to answer additional questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Giulio. And I'll take the opportunity to fire off a few questions to you first before I turn to Lennart. And my first one will be, are you on track on your timeline? Will we see this revised RED proposal on the table in June or perhaps early July? Where are you on that?
Yes, sure. We are on track on that. So as you know, we are finalizing our impact assessment. As I said, we're looking at different options on how to deliver on the increased ambition on greenhouse gas emission reduction, as well as renewable energy, energy efficiency. We're also revising the EU ETS, as well as other legislation which is relevant for bioenergy. As I said before, also LULUCF. Yes, so we are on track to deliver on the increased ambition set out by the European Green Deal.
So that means that we all know what sort of literature to bring on our vacation this year. No, that was a bit of a joke. One more question here. Concerning the no-go zones, do you foresee that you will have to have the sort of same extensive discussions with member states on no-go zones as you had before being able to propose criteria in 2016, I think it was?
I mean, the Commission proposal, as I said, will be based on the best available knowledge and evidence. We are looking at a number of options and assessing their social, economic, as well as environmental impacts. And then this will be, once adopted by the Commission, will be put on the table for negotiations between the European Council and the European Parliament. We know how sensitive is the issue of bioenergy sustainability, and I would say broadly the issue of forest management nowadays, because of the increased ambition on biodiversity conservation as well as climate change mitigation. So we're looking forward to have a good debate with the co-legislators at European level, as well as stakeholders. But before we're having that debate about the review of RED II, I would like to highlight again the importance to have a debate about the implementation of the current RED II. And in particular, when it comes to bioenergy, to have your feedback on the draft implementing act on the evidence for showing compliance with the sustainability criteria on forest biomass, which is up for public consultation as we speak.
Well, thank you so much, Giulio. And you will be with us for some more time here to take part of the later discussion. So I'll say au revoir for the time being, but I'll be back to you in a while. Before we go to our next speaker, let's have a look at a short movie to get inspired about different ways to decarbonize the transportation sector. Our next speaker is Ms. Josephine Nilsson. She is Business Development Manager for Biorefinery at SCA. And SCA is a company group which operates a large forest-based industrial ecosystem and which produces, among others, packaging material, pulp, wood products and renewable energy. And SCA is also Europe's biggest private forest owner. So hello, Josephine. How are you today?
Hi, Anna. I'm very good. Thank you for having me today.
Of course, we need to have someone on the show who is actually doing bioenergy, not just talking about it. So I'm happy to have you. And without any further ado, the digital floor is yours, please.
So thank you very much. I'm not sure. Can you see the slides?
Your slides will be there in a...
Very good. Perfect. Thank you. As mentioned, my name is Josephine Nilsson and I work with SCA. And I just wanted to give you a short recap for those of you who don't know SCA, even though I got a really nice presentation from Anna. So we can take the next slide, please. And as she mentioned, we are the largest private forest owner in Europe. And this is the basis of everything that we do at SCA. Our forest holdings, which are situated mainly in the north of Sweden, but also in the Baltic areas, which for some reason has fallen out of the picture, but we have some forest there as well. But without dwelling in this picture with the map of our forest holdings, you can also see marked out the industries that we have connected to these forest holdings. But if we go to the next slide, I think that is an easier way of understanding how it all belongs together. Because a big basis of what we do at SCA is explained in this picture, because all of it is about using the entire tree. Being a forest owner as big as we are, we know to value the forest, and we know that the feedstock that we take out from there is really necessary to become renewable in our society. And it all starts with the sort of finest part of the tree, namely the stem. And this goes into the sawmills, where it is produced into solid wood products. And this is important to remember, that this is one of the key drivers for the value of the tree. The value ends up in the solid wood products, and it's important to remember when talking about bioenergy. But some of the side products from the sawmills then go on further into our other operations, and the next one being the pulp and paper industries. Here we use different parts of the trees that cannot go into sawmills, but also some residue streams from the sawmills to produce pulp that then becomes a renewable feedstocks for tissues and that sort of paper products, but also packaging paper. And also from here, we have residue streams that cannot be used in this industry. And these, together with, for example, bark and sawdust from the sawmills, and some logging residues from the forest industry, goes into the bioenergy segment. And what I would like to highlight here today is our ambition that is very much connected to the Renewable Energy Directive, which is our ambition to move into the biofuels market. And then I talk about the liquid biofuels. So we already operate producing electricity, heat, wood pellets, and we also have a lot of wind power in our land. But if we go to the next slide, I really like this. This is what I envisage every time I go to work in the morning. So this is what a biorefinery would look like at our largest pulp mill, Östrand, right in the middle of Sweden. So this is not there today, but it's our ambition and vision to build this biorefinery, producing annually around 300,000 tons of liquid biofuels each year. And when mentioning a number like this, it's always hard, I think, to envisage how much is this. So in comparison, 300,000 tons of biofuels equals the amount of aviation fuel used for domestic aviation in Sweden each year. And this is one biorefinery. So we see that we can make a big impact. And if we go to the next slide, here you see the same sort of image, but from a different angle, with the pulp mill in the background and the potential biorefinery at the front of the picture. And here it comes into play what Anna also talked about in her opening speech about Annex 9, because this is really important for us in these plans, because we want to produce 300,000 tons of advanced biofuels. So that means biofuels that are considered especially sustainable according to the Renewable Energy Directive as it looks today, using feedstocks that comes from other parts of the industry and cannot be used in other parts of the industry, such as sawdust, bark, black liquor, etc. So this project is highly connected to the Renewable Energy Directive. But I also want to emphasize that a project this big, it takes time. It takes time to develop. And as one example of a part of the project that is not unique for this, that is the environmental permit process. This is a big process and it takes time. And we finally got the essential parts secured in late 2020. And this is something we've been working on for years. So these large projects, they take time and it's big investments also in money. But the upside of this is that what we also found in the permitting process is that this project could have the potential to reduce the Swedish CO2 emissions by 2.4% compared to the rates that was measured in 2019. So we could make a big impact, but I just want to emphasize that developing projects takes time, but this is a result of the Renewable Energy Directive that we have in place today and that we are seeing being implemented in the legislations today. And to conclude this, I would like to emphasize 3 things that I would like you to bring with you from this presentation. And that is, number 1, that it is all about using the entire tree. This is really important for us as a forest owner, to make sure that every part we take out from the forest comes to use and that we put value to all of it, both for society, but also in the industries where we put it. And number 2, which also makes me quite happy, is that we are talking about raising the ambition in the EU. I think this is really important if we're going to strive to become fossil free and to become climate neutral in the near future. So this is really important. However, it should not be confused, I think, with, and one should remember that if we start changing the basic rules, such as things described in the Annex 9A or something like that, that we might delay these large investments, which has been planned based on these rules that was set out in the Energy Directive that we are seeing being implemented in legislation as of today. And that was all for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josephine. And while you've been talking, I have been discussing a little bit with Lennart to see about the inflow of questions. And we did have one question that I'll take the opportunity of mentioning. You talk about long-term investments. What does long-term mean for you in your company?
Well, long-term for us, I think it's different from many other industries. We are based in the forest, and the forests grow for quite some time. We talk about planning that go for 100 years. So when we talk long-term, we talk, I say, more long-term than quite a few other industries. But it's important because planning a biorefinery or a project such as this one, it's a factory that is going to be big, and it's going to be around for quite some time. So this is what we mean with long-term, to be in the game for the long run and continue to contribute.
Well, thank you, Josephine. You will be back for the moderated discussion in a short while. But before that, we're going to listen to our last speaker, which is Mr. Patrick ten Brink from the European Environmental Bureau, abbreviated EEB. And Patrick is, let me get this right, Deputy General Secretary and Director of EU Policy at EEB. And just to remind all of us, EEB brings together over 160 civil society organizations from more than 35 European countries. Hello, Patrick. How are you today?
Fine, thanks. And thanks also for the invitation. Hope you're well too.
Of course. We know that the EEB is very engaged on numerous policy issues on the EU perspective. So we're very eager to hear your view on the future role of forest bioenergy. So please go ahead.
Great, thank you very much again. And just to add one statistic to EEB, it's also that we represent over 30 million people across Europe and in all member states. As you see from the agenda, I've been asked to talk about threats and opportunities, so you're expecting me to be highly critical in this, and I want to surprise you all by being positive to start off with. And then afterwards, I'll start on the positive elements, and then I'll talk about a wider systems perspective and what issues we need to be taken into account. So we move from would be better to could be worse if we're not careful, and then focus on some policy aspects. So what could be better to ensure that the opportunities outweigh the threats. So I'd like to first start with recognizing the importance of the forestry sector, and including the timber production. I mean, looking at the importance of timber and in building materials and so on. This is basically a way of locking up carbon for decades, if not centuries, and that compares very favorably to lots of other construction materials. And if you look at window frames, the wood is so much better than PVC. So it's very important to understand the benefits of wood and material footprints in this and realize the benefits. Also, the forest ecosystems are often highly rich and valuable ecosystems. I mean, it's rich in biodiversity, which we've talked about, but also valuable in carbon storage, which we've also talked about. But a lot of ecosystems do a lot of water purification benefits, recreation benefits, cultural heritage, and so on and so forth. And so again, thanks to the forest stewards for this important contribution when done right. And we appreciate the work of the forest managers. However, for the forest sector to be considered completely sustainable and for bioenergy to be sustainable and make a positive contribution, we need to also tackle the two major existential crises that are facing humanity. And one is, of course, climate, and the other is biodiversity. So we need to take into account the whole carbon and climate change and carbon storage aspect. So we see that in using biomass, in this, we still need to have a year-on-year increase in the carbon stocks in soils and vegetation. So we need to measure this in an honest and accurate way, so honest carbon accounting. So we have the evidence, and taking into account the latest science, including soil disturbance and other things. If we use the wrong maths, we get the wrong answers. On biodiversity, this has been mentioned in several contexts in terms of no-go and so on and so forth. But we need to also look at the biodiversity auditing. We need, if we have commercial forest plantations, they should be managed a way to maximize biodiversity or at least minimize its loss. Of course, we have a strong view that old growth forests should remain untouched. They're essential for biodiversity. They're also really fundamental for ecosystem services and ecosystem resilience. And the resilience issue is another thing that needs to be taken into account. And we see the wide range of services that are goods and services. I mean, we've mentioned timber, berries, mushrooms, you've got carbon storage, water purification, clean air and clean health and well-being. And so this just to underline the point that what is right for society as a whole also needs to be taken into account. It's not a one issue. Forestry is a multiple issue, multiple benefits for multiple stakeholders. So we need to remember that perspective. Now, when we look at forest biomass, it's not only the sourcing, but it's also some of the issue of the use. And it's important to underline sort of air pollution and human health links. Over the last decade, there's been ever increasing evidence of air pollutants affecting human health, from bronchitis and asthma to early mortality and even on early onset dementia, reduced birth weights, and the list is quite extensive and quite worrying. And if you look at the technologies that are there for burning biofuels, and unfortunately, a lot of them actually don't fare very well with respect to certain pollutants. So we have to be incredibly careful as to which technologies to burn them. There is the eco-design criteria, but even with innovation, the emissions from some of these are quite high. So we need to be careful when we're looking at the hierarchy of biomass use, what we want to use it for. We also need to make sure, if we want to be sustainable around this, the efficiency issue. I mean, prioritizing CHP plants over other issues. Again, the issue of cascading use principle has been mentioned, ranking the different uses from the top to the bottom. And we see very much the sort of the energy use in many of these cases, not at the top, because there is a competition between uses, but towards the bottom. And we also need to take into account the sort of criteria of global responsibility. I mean, we do have pellets imports into Europe, and they can often be linked to sort of degradation in other countries. We can't just export our responsibilities, so that's important. So then if you were to take all of these into account and tick them off, all these criteria, you'd say, well, okay, there is a potential opportunity around biomass, but maybe it's a bit more limited than we see if we do it carefully. And to put this question into context, one study says if we were to meet only 20%, only 1/5 of the world's energy demand in 2050 with bioenergy, we would need all the biomass that is now used for harvesting, for food, for feed, for energy and materials. So there is definitely a limit. Now, over the last 2 years, we and NGO partners CAN Europe engaged NGOs across the Europe for 2 years to look at different scenarios and different models and different assumptions on how to have a Paris Agreement compatible energy scenario. And we developed, and building on also lots of academia and lots of workshops. And we sort of had a vision for the future as to how much bioenergy is used in which areas as part of the wider energy mix, because there are different options. And overall, we do see a limited, strong use in some areas, namely in the industrial sector, where it's difficult to use other sources. And so with steel, ceramics, cement, and glass, we see bioenergy producing a useful role. Around 10% of industry's final energy demand can be used there. For solid biomass and heating, we actually see this as actually shrinking into the future. It's now 280 terawatts, but we see it going down to 114. So we're a bit less optimistic there with respect to, but that's also because we want to use the wood in other useful areas. So solid biomass can be shifted to non-energy uses, raw material and chemicals industry. And I think that's important. Earlier was a point made that we want to use all of the wood, but we need to remember that the ecosystem itself actually needs some carbon within it for its wider viability. So there does need to be some of the residues left in for the ecosystem health and so on. So that's also something that needs to be taken into account. And then, of course, we have to stay within the whole biomass cascade and waste use. So I think if we do all of that, then we're already on a good way. But it's a focused use, and with some selective some reduction. So in those cases, we won't have that much of a threat. We'll have much of an opportunity. But to achieve that, and just a few policy recommendations, we definitely see on the red revision that we'll need 50% renewables, not the 38% to 40%, which is mentioned. But within this, we don't see a huge expansion of biomass in this role, because we do see that there's the alternative competing uses, which are quite important. We do need to strengthen the environmental criteria, and I very much welcome Giulio Volpi's statement about the moving away from the 20 megawatts threshold, because this is a big loophole. And I also think the JRC's comment about implementation is important. But one word which hasn't been mentioned is the illegal logging, which is actually a problem and also a competitive challenge to the honest industries using honest methods. So we need to strengthen the environmental criteria, and I think we'll get into that a bit more. And there's a whole bunch of other issues, but I think probably we'll get back to them with respect to the questions. But instead of there only being the red, there's also the forest strategy, the LULUCF, eco-design, and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of things to do. So to summarize, I think there is an opportunity if we do it right, and there's a threat if we do it wrong. And so I think we'll have the same objective in mind of a sort of a Green Deal where we have a legacy, a positive legacy for future generations. So let's try to take on board the criteria to make sure that we realize an opportunity rather than create ourselves a threat. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to you, Patrick. I really like the way that you sort of on one side and on the other side. That's valuable for the discussions. One quick follow-up question, and I would also appreciate if you could give a fairly swift answer to it. You said we need honest carbon accounting. Should I interpret that as we're having a non-honest carbon accounting in Europe today?
Okay, I wouldn't say it's non-honest. I think it's a bit like mathematics, as anyone in the room knows. If you do a calculation, the answer depends not only on the method you use, but also on what you have as included in the scope. And I think when it comes to a lot of carbon issues, it's that how much of the ecosystem do you take into account? Do you take just the tree? Do you take the soil? Do you take the changes? So what we want to make sure is that the whole picture is taken into account properly and transparently. And if you do that, then it's that. And then the LULUCF, I mean, there are proposals for it to be amended and approved. So I think under the revision of LULUCF, I think there's some important opportunity to make the maths work, because none of us would use a calculator if you don't get the right answer.
Okay, thank you. This means that we are now going to proceed in the program to me holding a moderated discussion with the panelists. Unfortunately, Giulio is going to have to leave in about 2 minutes, I believe. So the discussion is going to be mainly between Josephine and Patrick. But on the other hand, you have both made such brilliant interventions. So I think we're going to be able to have a very bouncy and healthy discussion between the three of us. So the first topic we're going to talk about, we've slightly touched upon it already, but it is the role for bioenergy going forward up to 2030. So I can see that, Giulio, you are still with me. So we're going to do this way, that I make an argument and then you can either disagree or agree with me or elaborate your reply in whatever direction you want. So this time I start by arguing the following. We've all said today we need to increase the amount of renewables, and I argue that that also means that we need to increase the amount of forest bioenergy. Otherwise, several Green Deal objectives are going to be at risk. And I also stretch out and argue that forest bioenergy has a special role to play in decarbonizing the transportation sector. So, Giulio, before we say goodbye to you, to what extent do you think that my argument is in line with the Commission thinking?
I would say that it's broadly in line. I will also say that the vision presented by Patrick is broadly in line with the Commission modeling. We are seeing, in fact, as we move forward, that there is going to be an increased role for sustainable bioenergy, less role for low temperature heating from bioenergy, more for high temperature heating used in industry. Certainly we need biomass in the for advanced biofuels, but we'll still also need advanced biomass for combined heat and power, which will play an increasing role. Is a very efficient way of transforming energy into, biomass into useful energy. And of course, also linked with combined with carbon capture and storage as we develop this technology in order to reduce the emissions. Let me just say two comments on some statements that have been said before to clarify. Illegal logging, we're very agree that we need to avoid illegal logging. We have the EU timber regulation, which is currently under review. Let me remind you that under Article 29, the sustainability criteria of RED II, the first requirement is that the biomass, the forest biomass, needs to be harvested legally. So there is a cross-reference to the timber regulation requirement. And this is basically the baseline, both for biomass produced, harvested in Europe as biomass imported from third countries. Let me also remind everyone that the sustainability criteria, the enhanced sustainability criteria of RED II, have not yet been transposed by member states. So we have not seen yet their impact in the real world. This will hopefully happen in June this year, when there is the deadline for transposition. And finally, on the carbon accounting, let me just clarify that under the EU framework, bioenergy is not anymore assumed carbon neutral, as sometimes erroneously mentioned in the public debate. Under EU law, bioenergy combustion emissions are not accounted for in the energy sector, namely the Renewable Energy Directive, because these emissions or removals are already accounted in the land use sector under the LULUCF regulation. So the carbon impacts of any change in management of wood use relative to historical periods is fully accounted under the LULUCF. And as part of the review that we currently carried out of the EU climate and energy framework, we're also reviewing how to strengthen the LULUCF regulation. And on this, I thank you all very much for this opportunity, and I'm sorry I need to leave to another meeting. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Giulio. Take care and bye-bye for now. I'm sure we'll talk more later. So Patrick, you're next here. You've already stated that you wanted to see 50% renewables by 2030, but you weren't so specific on the role for forest bioenergy to play among those 50. So could you please elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. No, I mean, I don't have a specific number for 2030 in that perspective. But from our analysis and in terms of the PAC scenario, it is actually a reduction. The reduction today, I think it's probably around a 20% reduction if I look at my graph. And that's the would use be for other issues. So we don't. So with respect to your question, your supposition that more renewables and more forest biomass for energy, I'd actually disagree from our perspective, because we think the wood could be used for other means. Also, if you look at the renewable energy potential in other areas, if you look at photovoltaics and solar power, the amount of energy you get from a hectare is manyfold more than you would get out of bioenergy. And there's also lots of innovation in other sectors. So I don't think that the energy use from forestry is the competitor when it comes to the renewables, and that's our perspective, and that's the data we have. So I would argue that it will be less.
Okay, good. And Josephine, what is your view on this? I mean, you are a big producer of bioenergy today, but you also have quite a lot of windmills, wind power production on your forest lands. So where do you stand between these different types of renewables?
Well, I appreciate that question, because I find it interesting that we sort of sometimes tend to debate between different types of renewables. And I appreciate what Patrick says about that we probably all want we see the same ambition, we all want the same thing to happen, to use more renewables. But I also want to bear in mind, like when we are looking into using bioenergy, and then especially for one example, producing fuels, when we do this comparison to solar, but also to wind power that we have in our lands, we must remember that some sectors are more difficult to convert in this way. One example is the aviation industry. Producing aviation fuel we see that it is far away to have electrified aviation fleets, not only to talk about the maritime industry and so forth. So I think it's important that we get a mix in this system. And to go back to your first statement, Anna, of course, I believe that bioenergy will play a significant role, but that it's a big opportunity for us that we should utilize along with all the other types of renewable sources that we have.
Okay, good. Thank you. So slightly different views here, but it sounds to me as there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. We'll move on to the next topic, and that is the very hot one. Will the existingly or the today agreed sustainability criteria do the job or not? And we've heard quite a lot about it already. But this time I argue, implement the agreed criteria, let them work, and then evaluate them in 2026, as already is stipulated in the RED2. So this time you're first, Josephine. Where are you on this one?
No, but I think the directive as it is today is good. We have quite a bit of, there is a lot of sustainability demands in the criteria. And as you said, it hasn't been implemented yet. So I say that we implement it and evaluate and then make changes.
And Patrick, I can hear from your intervention before that it sounded as if you would like to see some changes already now. So can you please open up what type of changes would you like to be seen?
Sure. No, thanks. I mean, of course, the implementation is probably the main one, and getting that right, making it honored. But I think as mentioned before, there's a 20 megawatts limit at the moment, so sort of the threshold under the current rules, which is actually quite a big loophole for smaller players. So I think that one definitely we shouldn't wait till 2026. We should reform that now so that the smaller installations are also covered, or else it just gives too much. It just gives too much of a space and for freedom for that. And we should also really strengthen down on the illegal logging, because as we saw from the JRC's presentation, there were 14% unaccounted forest timber. I mean, maybe everything's perfect in Sweden, but I'm not sure it's everywhere perfect.
No, I do see your point. The 14% should be a concern for anyone engaged in forest bioenergy, because it's 40% that we don't know much about. Yeah, that's true. Let's move on to our third topic, and that's the resource-efficient use of biomass. And for instance, the cascading use principle has been mentioned several times already by several speakers. So this time I argue that forest bioenergy, to a large extent, I'm not saying 100%, but to a large extent, mainly comes from side streams, i.e. residues and wastes from forestry and forest-based industries. And I would therefore argue that the forest-based value chains work pretty well in Europe today, and that politicians should stay out from intervening with the way that those value chains work today. So let's see what you have to say on this, Patrick. You did mention the cascading use in your intervention, so please elaborate a bit.
Sure. I mean, well, the first point is that, I mean, I think there is a hierarchy of use linked to a hierarchy of value. If and where this is done perfectly, that's of course great. But I mean, I think it's worthwhile to reiterate this hierarchy. I mean, of course, that you should use forest materials first for the sort of the long-term forest products, like furniture and building materials and so on. And then, as I think as Josephine mentioned as well, then halfway down, it's the pulp and paper and issues. And then it gets down to the bottom, it's more the energy use side. But so I think we all agree that there is this hierarchy, and it's a question as to how to implement it. But there's a sort of another level of hierarchy linked to that is the end use. I mean, because some people use it now for heating, some to use electricity. So we need to move. So the lower, those are much, the electricity should be very much at the lowest level because there's so many better. And the CHP should be systematically replacing any use. So there's a sort of a hierarchy of energy use at the bottom of the scale. And then there's also a question that we often forget, and this is links to one thing Josephine mentioned about using every bit of the tree. I know that's the statement within a speech, so but within the wider ecosystem, there is the issue of the appropriation of carbon and the use of carbon. If you take out carbon from agricultural soils after the wild uses productivity, and similarly for forest ecosystem viability and health and functions, you need to have a certain reinsertion of the forest biomass. So, for example, we think that stumps should be kept in, and you shouldn't take them out because they're sort of long-term, biomass and humus production. And similarly, around 30, but it's a rule of thumb, but it's of course different in different ecosystems, but around a third of the biomass should be reinserted into the ecosystem to allow it to be viable, because it does require it. And I remember an American professor once said to me that an average acre of grassland, I know this is not a forest, but requires the equivalent of feed as 2 elephants. So there is a huge microbiotic community in the soils, and they also need some biomass. So that's also part of the hierarchy. So you need to put back into the system if you want the system to produce for you in the future as well.
I see. Thank you. And Josephine, you represent, as we said before, large forest holdings and large industrial activities. What's your view on the political system intervening, telling you how to use your own assets?
Well, I would actually like to start off with saying that I agree with you, Patrick, on the that we need biomass also to stay in the forest. And I just want to clarify what we mean with using the entire tree is that we want to make sure that the tree that we have already taken out of the forest comes to the best possible use and creates the most value in the end. But just as a figure, 1 out of 5 trees that grow in the forest that SCA holds, it will live and die a natural way and stay in the forest throughout its entire lifetime. So I think we're on the same page there probably. And as for your what you say, Anna, I think it's really important that we remember that sometimes when we want to do political, when we tend to go too hard in saying what we should use for what, we tend to miss what will happen in the future, what will development look like, we are talking about technologies that are being developed today that we still don't know the end result of. And I think this is important, and to remember that set the ambitions and set the goals, and then let the actors play out what needs to be done to reach these ambitions and goals.
Well, we'll see what the political proposal of the RED will say when it gets here on the table towards the summer vacation period. Thank you both, and we'll take us to our last topic of today, which is creating predictability for investors and also transparency for all stakeholders. So this time I argue that sorry, I just lost my word, but it's with me again. I'm arguing that the RED revision has to assure predictability for investors. And the only way to do that is to not completely change the game of the rule, because investments ongoing today are already based on the existing RED2. At the same time, we have to assure transparency, for instance, increased transparency on the biomass flows, as we've heard, for instance, from JRC. So this time, Patrick, you're first. From your environmental NGO perspective, is it important to create predictability for investors? I can assume that you would like to have a very good transparency on flows and the use of biomass, but what about the investor perspective?
Yeah, we all live on the same planet. So, I think we do need to, and we also benefit from all the products of various industries. So we, of course, need to appreciate that predictability is important. But so fully support that as a wider principle. The question then is, of course, how to assure that predictability and what does it constitute? So there, I think that I think there we need to have a clear set of rules that are there. And of course, you don't want to change them every week, but you don't want to then have your hands tied when your science tells you actually you've got a problem. We need to change direction. So it's a bit, otherwise you're like a super tanker that can't change or get stuck in the Suez Canal if you're not careful. So I think that's quite important. And with respect to predictability, I mean, there's multiple levels. There's the predictability directly of the forest industry with respect to a specific investment, and then there's predictability associated with, say, climate change, which is going to start. Or if you look at forest ecosystems around cities, the predictability of water purification and provision for those cities, or flood control. So I think there's multiple levels of predictability that we need to look at. And similarly, the whole wider this discussion exploded in the last few years about sort of resilience of ecosystem, resilience to climate change, resilience to invasive species, and so on and so forth. So there is also a need of predictability around that. So I think that as long as we don't chop and change every few minutes, I think there is, we all don't want to just do it for no reason, but the European system with its impact assessment is actually quite a conservative mechanism. So it is not tuned to basically change rapidly in the direction of just willful change. It actually is quite a studied approach. From an NGO perspective, we feel that it is much too cautious. From our perspective, we think the various challenges we face to society are much bigger, and we need less caution and more go. In some ways, you know, even need more industry that can do in a mentality in some of the policy areas. So I think so we also need a predictability that there is a future for us to all thrive and flourish in as well.
I really enjoy your words there, because predictability can have so many aspects to it. Thank you for adding that. So Josephine, I'm not going to ask you about the predictability because I know your answer is going to be. Instead, I'm going to turn it around a bit. So how transparent are you at SCA concerning how you use your forest biomass? And would you be willing to open up even more on that transparency?
I would say we are quite transparent as of today, what we use the biomass for in our different industries. And I would say we are quite clear in, when we talk about bioenergy, we are quite clear on what type of feedstocks that we are using, where they come from. And we are very used to operating in different schemes where we present where our biomass comes from, so that we can assure that it has a comes from sustainable sources and forestry. So I would say that we are quite transparent, and as a consequence of the Renewable Energy Directive, for example, talking about bioenergy and biofuels, I mean, we will have to present where it comes from and what it is made of. For example, how much sawdust went in, how much black liquor went in, and so forth. So I think we are quite transparent. But I mean, if there are questions, of course, we are happy to always. We want this to be good, and we want to promote sustainable forestry. So if there are questions that needs to be answered to help that, we are happy to do so.
Well, that's brilliant to hear. It is now time for me to turn to Lennart. So in a best of world, you first have one question for Patrick and one for Josephine. And then depending on how long answers they give, we might have time for a second round of questions. So what do you have?
Yes, we have a question here for Patrick. There has been proposals in the RED III discussions to limit the diameter size of the trunk or timber for energy use. When using the residues in the processing industry for energy, why does the diameter matter?
Is that a question to test my knowledge in the forestry? In which case, I'll throw up my hands very quickly. I'm not an expert on diameter of trees, I must admit. I'm sure Josephine would do a much better view on that. So I can't give a full answer. I can only give a partial answer. I mean, the diameter size, I think, links to actually cut down a big trunk tree. You actually lose a lot more carbon sequestration potential than if a smaller tree. A similar second issue is that bigger trees tend to be, well, obviously older, but they tend to be quite key elements in the ecosystem with respect to biodiversity in terms of habitats for a lot of forest animals. So there's both a carbon element and a biodiversity element why you shouldn't cut down trees over a certain size. I mean, that's maybe a bit of a simplistic answer, because I'm not a forester, but that's my understanding of the issues.
Yeah, okay. So it's a wider issue than just the bioenergy issue, even though it turns out up here in the red. Questions for Josephine? When you say you want to use the whole tree, are you also considering the below ground components? With other words, how do you define whole tree?
Well, this is, as I mentioned earlier as well, this is about the trees that we actually take out from the forest, what we have harvested. We want to make sure that we put all of this to the best use. But of course, we are also leaving some behind. I don't know if you remember, probably not because it was shown so short, but in my first slide, you could see there was a difference between the size of our forest lands and the size of our productive forest lands. So you should remember that some areas are put aside where we do no harvesting because the area is protected, but also in our harvesting itself, we leave trees at each harvesting site because we know we have to leave biomass in the area. So this is of course included because if we're going to have forests for a long time and continue to be a forest company, we need to take care of our forests, and this is an important part of it.
Well, Lennart, there's time for 2 more sets of questions. Do you have it?
I have for Josephine.
Yes, go ahead, please.
So Josephine here, there's another question for you. What are the main challenges in developing large-scale production of advanced biofuels, and how can RED help?
Well, that's a really good question. I appreciate it. So I would say the biggest challenges are that we are talking about new technology. And this is important to remember because bioenergy has been used for some time, but producing advanced biofuels from bioenergy is quite new. So this is important to remember. And we're talking about large scale projects. And the importance of the RED II comes in both for stabilizing and ensuring that we have a market, which is of course important for the investors, but also it is important because the need of support from the society to do this type of projects to become to take one step on the journey towards becoming fossil free.
Yes, Anna?
And do you have another one for Patrick?
No, I don't really.
Okay, well in that case, I will define one for you, Patrick, here. So the EEB, you gather, you know, as I said in the beginning, an impressively large number of different organizations. And I assume that in your organization, everyone doesn't always have the same opinions on all topics. So could you open up a little bit concerning forest bioenergy, specifically forest bioenergy? What sort of internal discussions do you have in the EEB family for the upcoming RED revision?
I think they're just I'm glad you're asking about the question about the new discussions rather than the ones years ago, because it's true, we do have, of course, I mean, we're an open church without being religious, of course, but and that we do embrace any NGO that follows criteria. And so we do have some NGOs who are very, very sort of biodiversity concerned and quite skeptical as to intentions and impacts. So they have a sort of a quite a clear and harder position. But we have others who have a sort of a more sort of a wider position in a way, and sort of more of an engage the stakeholders because we all live on the same planet. So there is a debate, and for us the debate has started to heat up, and we do have a lot of debates about if you do this but then don't do that, but then you have to have the whole systems thinking. So it's a bit like the same discussion about hydrogen and renewables, like let's go for hydrogen and have lots of renewables, say some people, but then you have offshore wind and then you have the impacts, and some people say yes and some people say no. So what we try to do is we try to listen to all of the arguments and chart a way through, which is why with respect to the PAC scenario, we must have had, I don't know, over half a dozen workshops with over 100 people to pull together the evidence, because EEB, we're an evidence-based NGO. We try to both listen to perspectives and the science and the facts, and then find a way through. And I'm a believer that if you go through in the thinking and you keep it open, you can actually get to something which is reasonable. Of course, it takes a bit of effort to get there, but most people believe in open arguments and rationality. So we're fortunate.
Okay, well, thank you for that very honest answer. And that, Patrick and Josephine, has taken us to the end of this moderated discussion and questions. So I say a very warm thank you to both of you. And then I'm going to turn my attention to our host today, which is Per Holmgren. So Per, are you back with us again? Let's see if technology works.
All the time I'm listening, of course, but I
there you are, and now we can see you as well. Very good indeed. Yeah. So you've been listening to the discussions. If you were to sort of define 2 or 3, let's make it 3, sort of takeaways from what you've heard, what would that be? Well,
a number of things. I'm not really sure if it comes down to 3 or not, but of course, a few things that I mentioned in my introduction as well, the importance of implementation of coherent criterion reporting systems. That is very important, not the least to have the predictability that you discussed. But I'm also very glad that Patrick especially pointed out that predictability is so much more than just politics, and it's also about bark beetles, wildfires, storms, everything concerning climate change. And I think that's the other most important thing taken away for me, anyhow. And I think that's often occurring during these sort of discussions and debates, that you hear a lot of things that would have been perfect 10 or 20 years ago. But it's like, to me anyhow, I can feel that we sometimes, it seems like we're forgetting the fact that I mentioned during my introduction, that we will reach 1.5 degrees globally in 10 years. We have a climate crisis that we tend to, if you ask me, forget about and treat it like a problem that we have some sort of different solutions to. But the hardcore facts is that we have a crisis, we have a huge dilemma, we need to take care of biodiversity, we need to focus on carbon sinks, but at the same time, of course, and this is where bioenergy comes into place, we need also to do this energy transition as fast as possible away from the fossil energy. But that will, of course, create different sort of dilemmas. And we really need to have this bigger picture all the time. And sometimes I feel that we sort of forget about that.
When we jointly set the title for this seminar, namely Sustainable Forest Biomass, Important Building Block in Reaching Green Deal Objectives, we put a question mark at the end of that statement. So to what extent do you feel that the discussions today have answered the question, or has the question mark even become an exclamation mark during the discussions? Where's your view on this?
Well, I reflecting back to what I just said, it in a way it's still a question mark, but it is also, I think it should also be an exclamation mark as well at the same time. I mean, anything that is per definition sustainable should be a building block to reaching these objectives in the European Green Deal, of course. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, there are clearly some conflicting knowledge claims, opposing interest regarding what is sustainable and not. And also, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, I think there are different views on how urgent the situation is. Are we having a crisis that we really need to manage somehow, or is it just a problem that we're still trying to find solutions to? And once again, 10, 20 years ago, most of the things that we've discussed today have probably been solutions. But now and then, during this decade, I think we really need to realize that we're in a huge crisis, especially the combination of biodiversity loss and climate change puts mankind and our society, our modern society, in a crisis in a way that we've never experienced anything similar before.
And I was personally very engaged in the RED2 revision, and I can say that it was it was pretty much a pretty tough negotiation in the Parliament. So if you were to look into your crystal ball, looking into the future, what kind of a negotiation climate, discussion climate around these things do you think it's going to be in the Parliament when the RED3 proposal reaches you?
Well, first of all, I would really like to stress that it will become a very, very important discussion and debate. And that is why one of the reasons why I think a seminar like this, for these 2 hours, are so important to have. I mean, we really need to sort of detoxify the debate. I can really feel when we're discussing bioenergy, not during these 2 hours, but generally in the public debate, it often becomes very black or white. And as I also stated during my introduction, we need some bioenergy in the transition because it's very important to find a quick transition away from the fossil energy. But we also then need clear to take into consideration the big picture once again, and often, I mean, how we govern bioenergy is often it has so much to do about uncertainty, about consequences, and conflicting knowledge claims, and also once again lack of transparency now and then. But I really hope that we can keep the debate going, and also I hope, of course, being a meteorologist and a climate expert, I really hope that the report from IPCC now during this year and next year will establish more knowledge and a platform of common knowledge that we can use in this debate as well.
Well, I think all stakeholders who are going to be engaged in the RED3 process needs to think about the detoxifying. I really like that expression of yours. So let's all do what we can to detoxify the upcoming negotiations. Thank you so much, Per.
Thank you, Anna.
And ladies and gentlemen, we have almost made it to the end of this event. But before we let you go, we are going to show you a short movie in which you can learn that forest bioenergy is part of a much, much larger forest-based system, and that the key thing is to make sure that you use the forest biomass resource efficient and that nothing is wasted.
Thank you very much for participating today. Enjoy the film.